Great. So thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Yasmin bin Humam. I'm a financial sector specialist at CGAP, and CGAP is convening this workshop today. You'll note that you've all been muted upon entry. We will unmute everybody later, of course, but for now, it would be great if you could just drop a note in the chat if you're having any kind of problems, technical issues or whatnot, and my colleague Daniel can hopefully help you troubleshoot. So CGAP has designed this work program as part of its learning agenda on social norms and women's financial inclusion. We feel that this is an area that's underexplored, and we're looking forward to learning together with you today. We can proceed to the next slide. I will just introduce some of my other colleagues who are here today. Nikki Post is a CGAP consultant, and she has been the one undertaking this personas exercise. We've been leveraging her experience designing financial products together with financial service providers for this exercise. Nisha Singh is a CGAP consultant who regularly facilitates activities and events regarding social norms and women's financial inclusion for us. I'd also like to welcome my colleagues Adriano Scarampi and Uloma Ogba from Market Share Associates. They conducted a lot of the social norms diagnostic and helped us to create the framework for analyzing social norms in women's financial inclusion. So they are here to answer questions that you may have had either in the chat or after the event or whatnot. We're glad that they could join us today. And unfortunately, Dima Bashar from Jury Research is unable to join us today because she's ill. Jury Research was the firm in Gaziantep that conducted all of the primary interviews with the women entrepreneurs who formed a part of this study. So I'll turn now to the roadmap for this presentation so that you know what to expect. I will kick things off with some context about why CGAP has conducted this research. What do we mean when we say social norms? I'll then turn it over to Nikki to give us some background on personas and describe our design process, what she did in order to meld our social norms findings into the kind of persona templates that she designed. And she will walk us through one example of a persona that we put together. Nisha will then, segue us into our persona design exercise, where we'll have breakout groups of 5 or so people, and we've tried to mix you up across institution. And at the end, we hope to come together as a group for some discussion on the presentation and breakout experience. If you click on participants, you will see the raise hand function. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand during the Q&A session. We will leave some time for Q&A before we get into the breakout rooms. So again, you just click on the hand to raise your hand, and then you can click on it again to lower your hand. And of course, there's the chat function as well. So let me kick it off with some context. I'll tell you a little bit about CGAP itself, for those of you who don't know. If we can move to the next slide. CGAP is a consortium of donor institutions committed to advancing financial inclusion. These are the members of CGAP, the donors, and we mostly conduct research with some pilots and advisory work, but our mandate is to influence global stakeholders and global practice in financial inclusion. And our vision as CGAP is a world where poor people, especially women, are empowered to capture opportunities and build resilience through financial services. Now we've added the especially women because we've been keenly aware of the gender gap in financial inclusion, and this has been consistently laid out by the Global Findex data set, which some of you may be aware of. In 2017, it showed that in developing countries, there is a 9 percentage point gap in account ownership between men and women. And while some countries are making progress, in other countries, the gap has been widening. Oops, dropped my phone. So that overall, the gap has remained the same. And, in Turkey in particular, there's a very large gap. In the Middle East and North Africa, there's a large gap. Together with South Asia, it has some of the largest gender gaps in the world. Can see that for some context on Turkey, which most of you are probably familiar with, financial inclusion rates have been increasing over the years, but still only 53% of women compared with 82% of men had accounts in 2017. On the right-hand side, you can see from these numbers that men are more likely to save with and borrow from formal financial institutions, but women are more likely to have saved in a savings club or with family. Now, CGAP doesn't have country strategies or in-depth country engagement. We use our research from the countries to feed into our larger regional or global messaging. Now, as I mentioned, we are interested in the Middle East and North Africa region because of these large gaps. We had an opportunity to do work in Turkey, which we were excited about. And we chose to conduct this study with Syrian women entrepreneurs in Turkey in order to try and get kind of the best of both worlds. We wanted some insights that could provide a starting point for our research in the rest of the Middle East region, in the Arab countries. But at the same time, we were able to verify some of our findings, all of our findings, in fact, with local Turkish NGOs who serve Turkish women and who said that a lot of the things that we were finding were resonating with what they were seeing. So then we will kick us off with a poll, which I think you got a little bit of a sneak preview of just a moment ago. The question is, what is the main barrier you see for women entrepreneurs starting or growing businesses? So hopefully you should be able to vote in the poll. I see votes are coming in. Excellent. As those votes are coming in, I'll just say the purpose of this is to make sure that you are awake and paying attention, and to get you thinking about some of your programmatic responses from your various institutions. So I still see some numbers coming in. I don't know, Daniel, if everybody else can see the polling results or if just the host can.
Only we can for now until I'll close the poll in 10 seconds. I see 2 people who haven't voted. We're on 100%.
Daniel knows everything on everybody. So
okay, I'm gonna be closing it right now then.
Great. Okay, some very interesting results. What we can see is that the answers were evenly split between lack of knowledge and lack of capital or money. And then next to that comes family does not think it is acceptable for her to start a business. And we had one respondent who responded fear of failing. So this is very telling. All of these, nobody selected other, which is interesting. All of these options are related to social norms. So clearly, I think the theme of social norms is one that's resonating with all of you here today. I'm going to X out the poll results. And if we can move to the next slide, I'll just give a brief primer on what are social norms. So we define social norms as expectations of behavior held by a collective group of people that governs social behavior. So for example, I'll give one that I've observed emerging recently. It doesn't apply in this moment right now because everybody has been forcefully muted, but I'm sure we've all been attending a lot of Zoom meetings and Zoom events lately. And we have certain norms around professional communication and giving each other the space to speak and directing your attention to the speaker. And oftentimes this leads to the behavior of participants muting themselves in these kinds of meetings and interactions. So that's a new norm and associated behavior that I've personally seen evolving in this COVID context. So the presence of the following characteristics help identify when a behavior is influenced by a social norm. First of all, expectations. People follow a norm because they believe that others follow it, right? And they believe that others expect them to follow it. The second is prevalence. A significant number of individuals collectively follow a norm or enforce it. If it's 2 out of 100 people, it's not a social norm. It has to be prevalent. And third of all, the existence of sanctions. So breaking a social norm usually leads to a positive or a negative response by an influencer group. And we'll get to influencers in a moment. And negative sanctions are a strong indication that the behavior is normative. So if we move to the next slide, I'll touch briefly on influencers. Now, in our study, which we conducted, the key influencers we found were mothers-in-law and husbands. And then, of course, there's the community at large. Now, I want to pause here because we sometimes talk about the role of men in women's financial inclusion and lump all women together, but that's a real mistake. So these are some quotes that we actually heard in our study. We had mothers-in-law saying things like, women have no business or need for financial services. We had husbands who were willing to publicly state, I'm okay with my wife managing her own money. And some of the community perceptions were that men can take more risks because they're encouraged and it's acceptable if they fail, unlike women. So that it's influencers, influence the acceptability of failure, and that differs between men and women. So I'm going to give now an example of our approach in the social norms diagnostic. Our starting point is actually the box on the right-hand side with the little orange box. And our starting point is the use of financial services, right? That's the use of our mandate. And we want women to access and use business loans, right? We know about the value of this. And what we see is that they're not accessing these business loans. Some of the data I showed earlier speaks to that. Women are 50% of the population. So why aren't they engaging in higher rates with financial services? Now, working backwards from that, we probe the norms and behaviors that link to this outcome objective around business loans. And we see that the social norms are, for example, that women should not be caregivers and should not own large businesses. And this leads to the behavior of women not growing their business, and as a result, not taking on these kinds of business loans. Now, of course, social norms are not the only drive of the behavior. This is a simplification. There are so many things that factor into this, context and availability and whatnot. But social norms is what we're looking at in particular and calling out. So I'll touch briefly on the financial behaviors that we observed in our study. So that middle box. And we have the outcome of women's use of and access to bank accounts. I mentioned earlier the 30 percentage point gap. There were 3 key behaviors. These are just the key behaviors, right? The priority ones that we identified, were that women do not use formal financial institutions. Women do not independently operate bank accounts for the most part, or women open and manage bank accounts in secret. And for our other outcome regarding the use of and access to business loans, we found 5 key behaviors. And these were that women either don't start or they don't grow their businesses. Women don't take business risk due to fear of failure. Women do not apply for loans independently. And women do not take interest-bearing loans. So these are the behaviors that we observed. So how do social norms link to these behaviors? I'll touch upon the four priority social norms that we identified in our study. And these were, first of all, that women should not have financial privacy from their husbands. Second, that women should not have savings of their own. Women should not have assets in their own name, and women should be caregivers and not own large businesses, as I mentioned earlier. Now, of course, there were additional norms and other factors, but these were the ones that, of the social norms, we identified as most relevant. And if you've already read our diagnostic study, that's great. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to read it afterwards. What we do in this study is we link these norms, these four norms, to the 8 key behaviors that you saw in the previous slide. And my colleagues Adriano and Uloma, who are here on the call, were instrumental in that analysis. It's a bit complex, so we won't get into it today, but hopefully you can appreciate our approach on that. So to see if you're still awake and I haven't put you out to sleep, we will conduct a second poll before I transition to my colleague, Nikki. And the question here is, have you developed personas in 8 of your work programs? Yes, no, or possibly. I'm not sure what personas are. Now, the reason we're asking this is because we felt that even with the diagnostic that I shared on the previous slide, we needed more, because even if certain norms are prevalent, different women experience these norms differently, right? And second of all, there's an intermediate step missing between, okay, we have this diagnostic, we know what the norms and behaviors are. So what do we do about it? How can we make this actionable? So we decided to design these personas to see if that would aid in the process. Daniel, I think the poll is still open. It says attendees are now viewing questions, and I'll defer to you on when to close the poll. I see 85% have voted. Daniel wrote in the chat that the poll is closing soon. Okay, so attendees are now viewing the poll results. Great. So, you know, 44% of you have used personas before, 33% have not, and 22% possibly you're not sure what they are. Well, that's a great mix. Hopefully some of you who have developed personas can, you know, lead in the discussions on your own experiences in the process. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Nikki.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin, and really helpful to just get that snapshot to hear that 44% of you have already had some experience with persona design, 33% not quite yet. So, you know, as we go through the discussion around the persona design process, and then we go through our actual design exercise, it will be really fascinating and helpful for us to hear a little bit more about some of your experiences. Or for those of you who haven't yet done personas, perhaps it's thinking about segmentation and really pulling in some of your experiences later on in the discussion. So we thought it would just be helpful as we are just kind of priming the conversation to really set the tone and understand how we've been talking about personas. So next slide, please. So we have been, we've used personas in this work as they serve as a representation of a user. And this has been based off of user research and captures their goals, their needs, pain points, and interests around, particularly around financial services for this work. They help to tell a story and describe why people do what they do to help everyone involved in the design of a product and service to really understand, relate to, and remember at the core the end user throughout the design process. Personas can really help to also communicate the multidimensional layers of women. Next slide, please. So here we just wanted to provide a couple of the key characteristics that we used while we were designing these personas. It's important to mention here that while personas can capture a representation of a user at that time, people are constantly evolving. I certainly am. I hope I still am, and changing. And it's going to be important to periodically re-examine your design persona to see if those products and services are still relevant. So some of the characteristics of personas that we were really looking at were around context, behavior, attitudes, needs, pain points, goals, and motivations. We also are looking at them, as I mentioned, as a snapshot of the customer. And then finally, really, that they reflect a pattern or a representation again that was based off of research. So moving on to the next slide, please. So within the next slides, we'll walk you through the actual process that we took. Next slide. The design process is broken into 2 phases. So the first phase was around collecting data through the social norm diagnostic. This can also be through the form of a gender assessment. This can help to capture data on women as clients and what norms impact their financial lives and how. So as Yasmin had mentioned earlier, CGAP and Market Share Associates have been exploring developing a social norm diagnostic tool based on the research conducted in Turkey and exploring in other regions within the Arab world. And you can read more within the link that Yasmin had shared in the initial email. But we won't again be talking as much about this process today, so stay tuned. The second phase is the persona design process. So we took data from the social norm diagnostics, or again, you can use data from a gender assessment. And we group the data based off of those key attributes, like the demographic details, behavior, motivations, pain points, as I'd mentioned previously. We then analyze the role of influencers, the role influencers play in supporting or inhibiting the persona's access and usage of services. So woven through, and you'll see these 3 questions that have just popped up on the screen, woven through the 5 steps that we'll be talking about in just a moment, are questions that can help assist designers to unpack how identified norms impact and shape these differing personas that will be designed. So the first question is, what are the attributes and characteristics that shape a persona? This helps to provide that snapshot of who that customer is or who she is. Why she behaves the way she does. So this looks at what her motivations, agency, decision-making capabilities are for her to be able to access and use financial services in her day-to-day and business life, as well as we start to look at some of those key influencers and how they impact her both negatively and positively. Finally, the third question that we have woven through the design process that we're asking are how she behaves as it relates to financial services. So more precisely, how she may access and use the services, how those key pain points limit or support her ability to use these services, and how influencers may impact her financial decision-making capabilities. So let's go through the 5 steps that we did take. The first one is analyzing the data. Here, designers will analyze data from the diagnostic or assessment and begin to group these key attributes or characteristics, her behaviors, pain points, how influencers support or inhibit how she acts and behaves as it relates to financial services or seeking to start entrepreneurial activities. It's important to know that there's an array of resources that you can draw from. So that could include ethnographic research, feedback from customer surveys, particularly for financial service providers, quantitative metrics, usage rate segmentation models, et cetera. So those are some of the other examples that you can be able to pull metrics from. You also may need to fill in certain information gaps with secondary research and interviews, which we'll come to later on in this cycle. The next step is to map the norms. And we're going to take a deeper look at what this actually means on the next slide. But just to give a sort of the overview. So we'll use the initial analysis from step 1. And we take the identified norms to map the strength or weakness of the norms. This will help you as a stakeholder to identify the entry point services you may be able to adapt or develop. We use questions like, do women adhere to a norm? Will key influencers expect the norm to be followed? Or what are the consequences if a norm is broken or ignored? These help to provide a deeper understanding on how and why these norms are influenced, followed, shaped, and governed by these differing personas. So step 3, this is where it gets to be a little bit more fun and exciting, is we start to generate what we've been calling a straw woman. This is essentially a composite persona. And it's good always to develop a few personas to be able to test and subsequently refine. So here we're moving to step 4, which is the test and refine, and refine phase. So now we're able to really test the straw woman along with the identified normative barriers. We were able to do this by crafting stories that highlight these key attributes along with the normative barriers of this straw woman or this persona, and really ground truth if these assumptions and what we were learning and hearing and analyzing are actually accurate. We made sure to engage a variety of stakeholders that may be within the persona sphere. So this would include family, community members, local, government, and private sector actors. While testing it, it was critical to also conduct a deep dive through interviews and discussions into what services may be appropriate, their preferences, and really digging into why. Next click. And so then based off the findings and feedback, we installed these feedback loops to continue to refine and iterate on the personas as we were walking away from the information during the test. The last step is around action, and this is where we are today. So this is our opportunity to share personas, and we would certainly encourage, as you are developing personas in your own work, to share the personas with other stakeholders and the approaches that you have found that has worked, has not worked, and where we can learn from. And this can really help to deepen programming or service offerings to women to begin to tackle some of the more systemic barriers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going to take a closer look of that step 2 around mapping the norms. It sounds easy, but what does that actually mean in a practical sense? So we understand that not all social norms have the same level of influence and strength. And so this spectrum displays how normative influence, so this is what others think should be done, can vary from strongest in the red box to the weakest in the yellow circle, not box, excuse me. The strength or stickiness of the norm is based on the sanction against breaking the norm. Here, so we've provided this example around the norm that women should not have financial privacy. So we see the weakest norm, sorry. So we have the weakest influence. So this is where it's possible to break the norm as the repercussions are not as high. So the example is a woman can save money on her own without her husband knowing about it, and it likely could be okay. Next, we're going to the weak influence. So violating the norm is tolerated by the immediate influencer. So that could be, again, husband, community at large, as we went over previously. She saves her money and her husband knows, and her husband may know, but maybe not the mother-in-law. And again, these are just illustrative examples. The next is the strong influence. So breaking the norm is inappropriate as the sanctions are stricter. So community members may make fun of the husband if the wife won't let him use the savings, these kinds of things. The final one is around the strongest influence. So compliance to the norm is obligatory, as the sanctions could lead to ostracization from the community or even in extreme cases, violence. So through the persona design process, we were able to use this spectrum to map the strength of the norm against the developed persona's key attributes, demographic details, et cetera, behavior, motivations, pain points, and begin to identify opportunities and potential entry point services. Next slide, please. So within the next few slides, we're going to be providing an example that was developed off of the social norm work that Market Share and CGAP had conducted in 2019. And again, the persona research that we conducted in 2020 before before the days of COVID when we could travel. Next slide. So we just wanted to give a brief background as to where we were able to pull all of this data to create that representation of a persona. So I should mention that we did create 4 different personas based off of the user insights from 93 different interviews conducted by Market Share Associates and CGAP during the social norm diagnostic, and then the subsequent 30 interviews to ground truth the persona. So this is a total of 123 respondents. And you can see the mixture of the type of respondents we were able to engage with. The persona that we are presenting here was developed as, again, a representation from many data points from user research. It is through the personas that we unpack the layers that shape A, how women behave, and then B, how others expect women to behave as it relates to financial services and their entrepreneurial activities. Next slide, please. So I would like to introduce you to Hanan, or what we have dubbed her as the pragmatic provider. And you'll see why as we talk a little bit more about her and get to know her. So this is Hanan. She has started a home-based kitchen business. She was put into the role as an entrepreneur out of necessity as her husband fell ill and is no longer able to work. He still tries to involve himself in her day-to-day business and expects to know the weekly income. Her business is doing quite well, and she's now considering to expand her business by purchasing a new and more efficient oven, but she's unsure that her husband will support this decision. In the past, she's not been encouraged to be a financial decision maker within her own household. But again, out of necessity, she's thrust into this role of having to make decisions. Now that she earns her own income, she wants to start to use financial services. If you could just stay on the previous slide, thank you. Now that she earns her own income, she wants to start to use financial services, starting with opening a bank account. However, she's worried that people outside her family will judge her for having a financial account or taking a loan to purchase this new asset of the oven. She will do anything to support her family to secure their livelihood. Despite these concerns, she has begun looking into banking services. Initially only interested in Islamic products, but recently she has been engaging with a trusted employee to learn about other types of loans and starting to compare costs. So it's on this slide that we capture what are the attributes, what are the characteristics that shape this pragmatic provider, and we begin to weave the tale of who she is. Next slide, please. Within this slide, we are able to really look at why Hanan behaves the way she does as it relates to financial services and entrepreneurial activities. So we start to look at what her motivations are to use financial services. So if you could click to the next two. Hanan has always seen her husband as the provider, but they must work around this norm for her family's livelihood. And her business has grown, requiring her to need more assets. And finally, she would like a safe place to save to be able to acquire these new assets for her kitchen and transact. In the past, she's not been supported to strengthen her financial decision-making capabilities, but here we now start to see the change. Next slide. And the next one. And here we're able to start to identify who are the key influencers. Within the next design slide, we actually start to unpack on the spectrum how the influencers, what is the strength of the influencers on this persona. We then look at what the norm is that has been impacting why she has behaving the way she has. So here, and if you click again, here we can identify the norm around her role as a caregiver and her husband as the primary provider, as a norm working against her ability to pursue her entrepreneurial activities, as it was something that she did not see was ever her role and believed the community at large also adhered to this norm, so would not accept her as an entrepreneur. Next slide. Next, we look at how she behaves. So this is the how she behaves as it relates to financial services and entrepreneurial activities. So how does she access financial services? She wants to use financial services to run her business and protect her business finances. She's less willing to take a loan if it's not Sharia compliant, but she is cost sensitive. So we already are starting to see perhaps there are some entry points of services that financial service providers could offer by tweaking, adapting, whether it's messaging or the actual product itself. We go into the section around pain points. So we have identified several pain points. She has low self-confidence and comfort in accessing information. She's aware of financial services that could be appropriate, but is dependent on a trusted source to get this information. Lastly, we look at the influencers as they impact her on her access and usage. As we have heard through the tale of Hanan, her husband is one of the strongest influencers. And here again, we are able to map the strength of the influencer and her ability to interact with financial services, and the norms beginning to slightly flex as the community at large sees her as a viable business owner, and that she's an entrepreneur out of necessity. So it is starting to be more acceptable for her to make business and financial decisions on her own. Her husband's influence remains strongest, but she sees ways to work around this norm as essential to her family's livelihood. And finally, looking at the norms that underpin this, the pragmatic provider, Hanan, is willing to break some norms to benefit her business and her family. As she is gaining confidence as an entrepreneur, she is willing to take more risk and may consider breaking, or more importantly, working around such norms as acquiring assets or taking a loan that may bear interest. Again, if it serves her and her family appropriately. Next slide. Finally, and this isn't always incorporated into persona design, but this is an opportunity to reflect on what are the recommendations and opportunities for a persona type like this. So given the information we have been able to create, we can now identify some of these key opportunities. So the pragmatic provider perhaps can serve as a model or influencer within their community and enterprise itself. The pragmatic providers are constantly evolving, and with appropriate messaging and information, they could be connected to new services. So maybe the entry point initially is Islamic product, but then it can grow from there as she gains confidence with utilizing services. Next, we look at, here we're also able to identify products and services that may be developed or adapted to meet this persona's needs. So targeted information campaigns, basic transactional accounts, perhaps a product like Ijara, which is a leasing product, could be an appropriate entry point service for her. We then look at some of the entry points for engagement, where it could be having an established bank relationship manager who helps to facilitate conversations with her about what are the appropriate products and services for her. Perhaps there's also an opportunity through another stakeholder, not necessarily just a financial service provider, who can provide clear messaging and information about what other services may be available, whether it be grants or then perhaps accessing a financial service. So I'll just wrap up this last slide. Within the invitation for this webinar, we did ask you to describe your broader institution work program, highlighting some of the work that you've been doing around women's financial inclusion, entrepreneurship, and gender. And so we heard comments saying that we work in the field of economic empowerment, entrepreneurship training, facilitating access to funding sources and support programs from other organizations was one comment. Another was supporting host communities and refugee communities with a focus on promoting social cohesion, gender equality, especially trying to target women more so in the future. And then finally, looking at a project, we are exploring the social norms that affect savings behavior in women and youth. Wow, you're already there. This is incredible. So we've identified a couple of opportunity questions just to really get us thinking, and stakeholders and providers thinking, how are the ways that I would be able to tap in and use a persona like the pragmatic provider to better hone my products and services, or to really better understand this market. So these are just a few reflections that we had on the pragmatic provider. Next slide, please. So we're back to the persona design process, but I promise we're not going to actually walk through it again. Now that we've shared this presentation on the personas and the design process, it is a lot of information, and we recognize that. So we're showing this process again just to get you ready to answer and respond to another poll and question about what other information might you need to strengthen your understanding around delivering this process. Is it more information around understanding how to analyze the data, map the norms, step 3 around generating the straw women, and likely we should have put another option of maybe all of it. So we welcome, this really helps us to understand how we can further strengthen our delivery of information. Great. So this is great. And I actually had expected that step 1 might have required a lot more support, but certainly the actual generating of the straw woman or the prototype is certainly an area where there will be forthcoming information. And in fact, there will be a forthcoming blog along with a link to a sort of background note that explains the process in more detail, as well as a template that will be available in the coming weeks. So we hope that will also be able to fill in some of the blanks, and then certainly we would love to have this as an ongoing conversation as to how we can support you all in this work. So at this point, we recognize, next slide, please, that we have been talking a lot about some very technical ideas. These are all very new. The design of personas is not necessarily new, but the overlay of social norms is. And so this is a new way of really thinking about how to understand women as clients or within entrepreneurship. So yeah, we've gone through quite a bit. And so we did want to just take a few minutes to see if there's any questions. And we are fortunate enough to have Yuloma and Adriano as well on the line if there are more specific questions about the social norm process. So really, we open it to you if there's any questions at this point. And I believe you can just type them in. You can raise your hands or you can type in the chat.
I would just add that if you do decide to type something into the chat, please select everyone from the drop-down menu. But chat is only for those who are particularly shy. So don't be shy to raise hand. I guess we already have our first question. Nikki, will you read it out loud?
Yep. Yeah, so I'll facilitate. Yeah, so and thank you, Samar. I hear that I work quite a bit on women's employment. Can this methodology be transferred to creating straw women for getting women into jobs? Yeah, I think this is a really helpful tool to really understand, well, what are some of the barriers that are inhibiting her from entering into the workforce or starting an entrepreneurial activity? For this scope of work, because it was so new, we decided to focus in on understanding what are some of the constraints and barriers around financial services and entry into entrepreneurship. But a lot also emerged around employment and what are some of the barriers to entering into employment. So this is absolutely a tool that could be utilized and adapted to that. And we would encourage you, as you test it, to share back with us as to what's been working, what's not, as well, so we can continue to enhance this and strengthen this. And I saw that there was a hand raised from, but then it now went away. Apologies. There was somebody who had raised their hand, so if you did, please just feel free to speak up. If not, we'll continue on with Louisa's question. Okay, in the interim. So Louisa, how many personas have you developed as a result of the social norms study? It's a great question. We developed four personas. We had a traditionalist, a pragmatic provider, a striver, and an entrepreneur, which were the four that emerged based off of the data. And we will be happy to share that. They're just getting sort of finalized and beautified, but we will be happy to share that in the coming weeks with you. Yeah, thank you. But I will say that for we followed the same format and structure for each of the personas. And within the next activity, okay, great. We will we'll invite you all to hear a little bit more about some of your experiences, because clearly there's been some great work that has been done in persona development. Yes, Summer, I would love to hear your question.
Daniel, maybe you can unmute Summer. Maybe she wants to.
Oh, yes, she can't unmute, or you can unmute. Yeah.
Yes, I think I'm finally.
We've released you.
I prefer to speak rather than write in the chat.
Yes.
So my question, so I've done a few of those personas. We were working on a project with AXA in India, and we were developing a customer value proposition for AXA India to service female buyers, purchasers of insurance products. And my question is, so the objective of these personas presumably would be to give that methodology or provide these actual personas to financial institutions who would eventually develop the products and put them in the market that would reach these women. Is that the ultimate goal, and is that what you're specifically aiming to do, or are you putting it out in the market and then FIs will think about how to take it from there? What's your approach? Thank you.
Yeah. No, and great question. So I mean, we really were aiming this to be both at the financial service provider level, where there's some in-depth reflection around what are the appropriate products and services that could be developed or adapted amongst their existing product line. However, what was really uncovered during our work was we interviewed entities like GIZ, and we're so pleased to have you all on this call as well, and UN Women, that they were doing quite a bit in the space around messaging, whether it be through radio, social media. And so what we also want them to be able to use these personas for is to really elucidate how they can better target their messaging to these kinds of discrete persona types. And again, this is a large so the pragmatic provider is a representation of a large group of women that were interviewed. So our hope really is twofold, that it would be at the financial service provider level for sure, but then also some of the other local stakeholders who are more engaged in the messaging, because I think what we're seeing is around the messaging, that's how that starts to trickle within the community to start to shift and maybe shape some of these normative barriers. So I'm not sure if that answers totally your question.
No, absolutely. No, it's great work. And so that this is public information that, for instance, our client banks could tap into, right? I mean, is that something that they would be able to access and leverage of? We have a product line called Banking on Women, whereby we give credit lines to exactly banks so that they then on-lend to female entrepreneurs. I mean, those entrepreneurs would have to be formal businesses and registered, which is I don't know whether that's one of your straw women, but formal businesses. And we also do a lot of capacity building with them, whereby we increase their capacity to actually do exactly that. So I wonder whether that's available information on the market that we could equip our client banks with.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Yasmin, maybe you would like to add, the vision for this. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, we've designed 4 personas. They are out there. We'll make that publicly accessible. We didn't want to take all night, so we only presented one to you today. And so, I think other providers can take our personas, but I think really the idea is that they would develop their own personas based off of, as Nikki mentioned, existing data that they have that looks somewhat at social norms, or perhaps sometimes, IFC, World Bank, other institution donors, they do country studies, and if they incorporate more social norms diagnostics into those kind of country studies, financial service providers and other stakeholders can take information from there to create their personas as they work with that raw data, and the hope is really that as you look at a persona with social norms overlaid, you start to think more creatively about, how is my product targeting this persona of women versus that persona of women, like nuancing kind of information offerings, product offerings, so forth, and also branching out to new partnerships, as you are targeting those particular personas. Perhaps you target their influencers together with them, perhaps you create joint financial products, perhaps you do marketing campaigns. And this is something that I know you have to leave early, unfortunately. Some are, that Nisha will delve into with us a little bit more. I also see that there's a question from, I'm going to mispronounce it and I do apologize for that, Ozen in the chat, Nikki.
Yes, it's me. I can come in. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I think this is a great study. This is Ozan from EBRD, and it's very informative, very mind-provoking, I think. We had some, by the way, also it's very good to see some familiar faces that we worked together in the past and still working together. My question is about the next steps, actually, that you put as one of the pool options to the questions. So I wonder what this could contribute as a next step. It could be some more elaboration on the, some data, because this is a very good diagnostic, I think, and we need that's kind of information to develop some targeted responses in the field. Whether this will be a policy engagement, whether this will contribute some, capacity development of the institutions, relevant institutions that could support women, whether promoting partnerships. So I was just wondering whether you have a roadmap or this is still on track.
Yeah, no, great question. I'm actually going to put my colleague Nisha on the spot as she is the facilitator for the Finequity group on social norms. And so maybe she has some recommendations and ideas, and certainly Yasmin, feel free to jump in and add anything from the larger CGAP hat.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. So yeah, if you're not familiar with Finequity, it's a global community of practice on women's financial inclusion. And our thoughts on some of this work is how can we make these tools available to more stakeholders to pick it up and then, use it. So in terms of immediate next steps, creating some sort of policy advice, could be something we can do under the umbrella of Finequity if there are stakeholders who are part of this meeting who are interested in moving forward on that. The whole idea is Finequity can offer that platform and we can bring together people on a discussion and unpack these personas to say, you know, these are some of the high-level recommendations for regulators or policymakers to consider to address normative barriers. Yasmin, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you've captured it quite well. I hope that we can engage you in those next steps, Ozan. And I think it would be good to probably move on to the next portion of the agenda, Nisha.
Great. So this has been great. And now what we're going to do is, since so many of you were interested in how to generate a straw woman, we're going to try and do some of that. So let me see if I can move the slides. So we're going to do a quick design exercise and discussion. It's going to be short. The whole idea is to give you a taste of it and not get into too many details, because as Nikki will tell you, this process takes a little bit of time, but we are just giving you a cursory experience, and then maybe you want to dig into it with your own teams. So just a few instructions to start with. You'll be placed in one of three groups, as Yasmin had mentioned at the beginning. You know, we've selected what groups you belong to. So when I'm done giving these instructions, you'll see a notification on your screen that your breakout rooms, you'll be put in a breakout room soon, in like 10 seconds. In the breakout rooms, you'll have Yasmin, me, and Nikki, one of us, facilitating the group, and we will give you further instructions. We'll share with you a file which includes a story of one of the women who was interviewed out of the large sample that Nikki mentioned, and also a slide that covers the social norms and financial behaviors that were uncovered as a part of the social norms diagnostic study. And then we'll guide you through a process of how do we take elements of that individual woman's story and start to populate into the template that Nikki shared for Hanan. So with that, I'm going to ask Daniel to place us into the breakout rooms. We'll have about 15 minutes in the breakout room, so it is very quick. See you in the breakout room, people in my group. Okay, welcome back, everyone.
Nisha, I can't hear you all of a sudden. I don't know if others are also having that problem. Yes, people are nodding. Your mic seems to have gone out.
I haven't moved.
Okay, now I can hear you faintly.
Okay, welcome back, everyone.
Oh, it's still, I'm sorry, it's still too faint. I know that
happened.
we've had this problem in the past with you. It depends on the breeze in your apartment and the angle of your face. So we should be able to get it in just a minute.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but it's a little bit faint. I'm not quite sure where the mic is on your computer.
Yeah, I have no idea. Okay, is this better?
Yes, yes. Actually, when you sit back, it's better.
Okay. So
perfect.
Sorry about that. It wouldn't be a good workshop without at least one technical glitch. So welcome back. I hope that exercise was interesting. I know we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is try to move through this next part very quickly. So just wanted to ask for some reflections, one person from each group to share you know, what were some of the pain points that emerged from your discussions? So whoever wants to start speaking, I will invite you. You should all be able to unmute yourself. Daniel, can you confirm that?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, so whoever wants to speak, please go ahead and share. What are the biggest challenges that you saw from your stories in you know, women accessing and using financial services?
I will make one brief comment from our group, and then I would invite others from my group to join in if they like. A big pain point we saw was around the pressure to do well, sort of being told that she would fail even despite past success, sort of that being not enough. And so the confidence was a key pain point that we saw. Also the pain point of inexperience with financial services. Our entrepreneur had previously relied mostly on savings. And so there was the added step of gathering the necessary information and taking that first leap for something that was actually quite big and significant. Anyone else from my breakout group is welcome to add or to reinforce anything I've said.
Yeah, I would really like to hear from people in the room, and I don't want to have to call on people, so.
Hi, Nisha. I just want to add that one of the biggest challenges that we saw was the gender role, which plays an important, it plays an important challenge for the women to empower themselves. And another thing was the family pressure or the social pressure.
In what way?
For which inculcated the fear of bankruptcy or the fear of failure.
Okay, so this is, sort of similar to the comment Yasmin made earlier. Okay, yeah. Any other things that were not around, the fear of failure, gender roles, or inexperience with financial services? Anything else?
Also, there was lack of privacy when they use their finances. So, for example, our case, the woman used to save with her mother.
Yeah.
So the lack of privacy also was a constraint.
Yeah.
For her.
Yeah, for sure.
And the control, also external control over her finances. So a big portion of what she gained went through to support the family, and the rest of it was saved through her mother. So also lack of empowerment or lack of control over the finances.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a very good starting point for how do we start to address some of these challenges. So are there ideas? Yeah, Hande, you want to add?
Also, we can say lack of knowledge, because they don't know which institution is the safest one, and also it's important for them to understand what products that they can use while they're enlarging their businesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also social norms, of course.
Okay, so we're going to get into problem solving mode very quickly. So how would you address some of these challenges? So let's take, for example, the lack of knowledge about financial products or businesses, or inexperience with financial services. Any thoughts, or anybody has any experience on how they might have done this?
In our case, with Hannah, she was in the Savings Association, so she was already somehow involved to deal with this.
Yeah, so savings groups or informal groups often provide a good first starting point to expand experience and knowledge about financial services. Any other idea?
May I?
Yeah, sure. I can't see everyone, so you can just speak.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
And say perhaps your name and institution, so that we know who's speaking.
Yes, Hande from Sparkassen. As an institution, we have a special modules for that. So we are collecting people and providing some knowledge for savings, and how to, we are also informing them how to enlarge their businesses, like increasing their knowledge how to use the right sources for their households and also for their businesses at the same time. So during the time period, of course, they're influencing each other, so they are supporting each other while they're getting the training. And the methodology of the training is like a board game, so they're having fun while they're learning. And also collecting people, apart from that, collecting people in one institution also makes them feel more comfortable, and it's also more easy for them to talk about their daily lives and daily businesses and get support from each other.
Yeah, that's great. So, some of these, it's about capacity building, it's about product design, but then you come to some tricky, like pressure from the this whole idea of women cannot fail, or women should not fail. So that keeps women, away from growing their businesses. So that's a
role models.
Yeah, exactly. So we need some larger messaging that might address some of the gender roles or expectations of women, and that is an area which, it's about changing perceptions and behaviors at the level of all the influences, whether it is the mother-in-law, the husband, or the larger community. How do you do that? And that's where we've seen examples of using things like radio or soap operas or TV shows or ads at social media that can be very powerful. I'm kind of rushing through all of this because I realize we're right at time. So Yasmin, I just wanted to check in with you and see if, and with everyone, if we're okay for staying on for 5 more minutes so that we can do an actual wrap up and get some reflections from the people on the call as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I love hearing from the people on this call about how they would address and how they do address these challenges. So I think it's worth spending an additional 5 minutes to hear from all of you, and perhaps you've worked together with each other on some of these things. I won't spend much time in wrap up because I think that we can do that in writing, after the fact. So please feel free to take away from my wrap up time. And I see that Ola has her hand raised.
Okay, Ola, your turn.
Thank you. I also believe that maybe a kind of initiative that can solve these kind of challenges is also to integrate protection initiatives or activities within the livelihood pathway by providing legal counseling for specific cases such as the GBV cases.
Yeah, and that's something that has to always be thought through because with any economic activity, the potential for gender-based violence is always there, and it depends on a number of factors existing in the community. So while designing programs, that has to be considered.
Thank you.
Okay. And any other thoughts? And the one other point that I want to check on is, as stakeholders, we can't solve these problems by ourselves, and we need to start thinking about collaboration. So I know some of you this call already work together, but how do you have any thoughts on how you could address some of these pain points and challenges through collaboration with others on this call or others that are not there, but would be a good partner?
So you were talking about, Sasha, GSZ, you were talking about the role models.
Yeah.
I think the women entrepreneurship associations would play an important role.
Okay.
Strong businesswomen encouraging other women to open a business. and yeah, and then having also supporting small businesses through these associations, yeah, with capacity.
Can I ask, actually, if you don't mind me jumping in, Nisha, for Sasha to expand a little bit on how you might partner with the business association, apart from just, funding? Is there any kind of joint programming that can be developed, or sort of what might that collaboration look like? To put you on the spot, and if you don't have the answers, of course, that's fine.
I don't have the fast answer on this, but I mean, we are working with a startup hub at the Chamber of Commerce, who are supporting women entrepreneurs, startups, and we are supporting the legalization of micro businesses. That is not through an association, but if we are going to support more women entrepreneurs, we have to work with the Women Entrepreneurship Association. I've done this before in other countries, and yeah, to link them. And in the case of Turkey, that the Syrian women are included, integrated in these programs. Because this was also I had one question. What are the differences between Syrian and Turkish women regarding these norms? Are there any? And if yes,
perhaps Adriano and or Uloma, you'd like to address this a little bit, since you were involved in the direct research, and I can add afterwards if need be.
Yeah, so sorry, do you mind just repeating the question?
The question was around, how do social norms differ between what Syrian women entrepreneurs faced and what Turkish women entrepreneurs faced? I mean, at first glance, it was, I would say, very, very similar. Of course, there was the added changes that Syrian women saw because they weren't in their home context. So perhaps you can speak more to that, Adriano.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there is something to note that social norms are very similar globally. Many of the social norms that we did encounter in Southeastern Turkey with our target group were very applicable to other countries and other contexts. They were very relatable. What differed, perhaps, were the way they were enforced at times and who some of the key influencers were. And I think that really what makes the difference when carrying out social norms research, those nuances of how they are applied. When we spoke to stakeholders in Istanbul that were primarily working with the Turkish local populations, they saw a lot of similarities, actually, especially even in the way, well, of course, at the overall level, what the social norms were, they saw them, they applied, but then also how they were enforced to an extent in perhaps in many of the Turkish settings. So yes, a lot of similarities in general, some nuances, but I think we'd be lying to ourselves in a way if we thought that social norms were so unique and wildly different in a specific location to others across the globe even.
We have a hand raise from Hande but Sasha, if you had any follow-up for Adriano before that.
No, thanks.
Okay, so we have a hand raise, Hande, and someone else. I'm trying to see.
I can add a little bit for the differences of the Syrian and Turkish in here. It depends on the education, actually. If the education level of the Turkish people is woman is high, then it doesn't, they will not face with any kind of problem while they're opening their own business. But if the education level is low and they are more living in rural areas, then there can be a pressure just like Syrian people.
I agree. Exactly. I think that was definitely one of the comments that was made, especially in the more conservative settings that were extremely similar.
Thank you.
Amina, did you have a comment? Oh, go ahead.
Amina or me?
Uber. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, just another options that maybe I can offer about in the procurement or the supply chain side of the big companies. For example, of course, we are supporting the women businesses, cooperatives. It's definitely fine, but it has to be in this. They have to be in the also supply chain process. So we should also dealing, or we also propose on that the big companies, they should put one of the some points or regulations to purchase some their maybe 1% or more through the women cooperatives or women businesses. So it's gonna be developing the supply chain process of the big companies. Will support the women businesses or women cooperatives.
I would like to just say one thing, if I may. As a prerogative of a co-presenter, I can jump in when I like. But I like this point because I think it speaks to the points that we mentioned earlier about this kind of fear of failure, in the community. And I think if they are set up to fail, then they will fail. And so linking with these kinds of procurement initiatives helps to get a leg up in this kind of context where everything else is stacked against you, and it speaks to the new kinds of partnerships that we need to develop in this area, partnering with private sector firms for the supply chain and the Women Business Association, linking those two parties, is something that I think we could do more of in the sector going forward. And then I know Amina wanted to make her comment.
Agree.
Hi, Nisha.
Agree, definitely.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amina from the Turkish Islamic Microfinance Program. And I just wanted to add that we are basically providing microfinance services to the unbanked, the financially challenged Turkish and Syrian micro entrepreneurs in Turkey. And as Hande has mentioned, it's very important, the educational level of the individual, because we actually target the rural areas in the southeastern part of Turkey. And we have seen that the behavior between the Turkish and the Syrian women has been very negative in the beginning of our project. We are having mutual projects with Hande and George from Southeastern Stiftung. So we are working on the same purpose, same project, and it involves providing financial assistance to these women. And at the same time, the social cohesion of the Syrian women within the Turkish community is also one of the aspects of our project. So in the start, we also started to fear about the results of the project because there was a lot of negative attitude and negative behavior from the Turkish local community regarding the Syrian women and regarding their ideas to accepting that the Syrian women can also become entrepreneurs and live a respectable life just like themselves. But eventually, with the passage of time, the capacity building sessions and the mentoring sessions we provided to both the host community and the refugee community, right now we have been able to overcome that behavior. And now we have also seen that both the Syrian community and the Turkish community are getting along very well within our target group. They are supporting each other and they are trying to help out each other in any possible manner. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Amine. So I realize we're way over time, so I'm going to wrap this up right now. I hope this exercise was helpful in beginning to at least understand the process that was involved in developing these projects. And Yasmin, I'll let you close out.
Excuse me, may I add something? It's
Sure.
Ola speaking.
Who's speaking? Sorry, could you repeat?
Ola, I think.
Ola,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I would also like to add that a networking event that we can facilitate the integration of those women into the local market with such kind of event.
Absolutely. That I think that's something that we see a lot of. I think the thing that is most clear for me from this session is that this conversation is just beginning, really. There's so much willingness to participate around the room, which is fantastic. And I hope that, we, as Nisha said, we have Finequity, which is a community of practice on women's financial inclusion. We'll be sending out information afterwards about how you can all join those platforms to discuss amongst yourselves and people in other countries on these exact topics. We'll be hosting webinars in futures and discussions. There are new norms that you guys have all brought up today that are very interesting, particularly around, host community expectations and behaviors vis-a-vis newcomers, for example, that I think need to be explored further in financial inclusion. Our objective with this is really just to really open up this space. CGAP, as I mentioned, is a consortium of donors, and we see that for the most part, most of their funding goes towards microfinance institutions to provide credit. And they're not really thinking innovatively, and they're not really thinking around, social norms-based programming, but we really see the tide shifting around that. And we want to help that change in approaches. So thank you all for participating. We'll be sending out a message afterwards with resources for you all to use as you continue this journey. We'll be sending out an evaluation form, which we're really grateful if you can complete. And feel free to reach out to any and all of us if you have further questions. One last thing I'll mention before I forget is that Amina was kind enough to share a link with me on an interview with a Syrian female entrepreneur that she asked that I share with the rest of you. So we'll be sharing that in our post-workshop materials as well. So I'll stay on the line for another few minutes in case anybody has anything they want to tell me or share with me. But apart from that, thank you everybody for engaging.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone, this is fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm just here for a few minutes in case anybody wants to write me something on the chat or share anything.
Yasmin, I just wanted to ask a short question.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask if there are any Islamic products or interest-free products that can be offered to the Syrian micro entrepreneurs, since they are reluctant to take interest-bearing loans. So during your research, maybe you might have come up with some recommendations for them, because I believe this is one of the major factors that that discourages them to open a savings account in the local banks or to opt for a loan because they have to pay the interest.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And it's something that Adriana and Uluma surfaced in terms of, because women are already being skeptically looked at when they approach these. If it's non-Sharia compliant, then it's kind of like the final straw for people looking at these women. And I don't know that there were any products in particular that were flagged. I think for the most part.
Yeah, maybe I could just jump in here. So during the personas research, actually we did, there was quite a few around Mudaraba and Ijara that came up as products that really the gambit of ages were interested in. Also, silver and gold accounts were of high interest as well. but it was interesting. I would say that from maybe a bit of the older population was a bit more interested in the Islamic products pretty uniquely, whereas we heard maybe, you know, the 50s, 40s and below were interested in wanting to hear about it, the Islamic products available, but that they want to hear about all products to make sure that they were getting, you know, the best terms and conditions. And so that was something that really did come out loud and clear. But again, I think that the 3 products that we heard, insurance didn't come up too much on Takaful, but again, it was more around the Ijara and Mudaraba.
Maybe if I can add, I felt that maybe in more generic terms, because there are some quite strong norms and preferences to, you know, and reluctance actually to engage with any financial institutions because of that fear that it's not compliant. I felt that awareness. There were some financial institutions that were actually compliant, but people did not know of that, and there wasn't really enough awareness to give, especially women, the reassurance that they were compliant. So I think that, you know, especially when norms are particularly strong, I think an extra effort probably needs to be made to make sure that people are reassured, not just women, but the you know, the influencers too. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
All right, well, Daniel, I know that you have many other events and dry runs and things going on, so I don't want to keep you. And I think we can close it out and debrief.
Right.
Right.
Thank you so much.